want to respond to either each other's comments or to Daryl's comments / provocations?
Lisa's included.
Lisa, of course, is included.
Oh, Lisa already here?
She's a bit static right now. Why don't you get started? We'll bring her in if she wants to.
I want to pick up on the abandonment as a form of control. I specifically think that part of sovereignty is the abandonment. It doesn't mean there's still that relationship between the sovereign and the subject or whatever category you want to put it. That is a firm relationship. The fact that it's like with privatization, the fact that something is privatized doesn't mean that there is no authority there. So I'm on board with that, and I think that part of this idea of abandonment explains better. Instead of saying there was more control, less control before Oslo, and this is all depending how, if the army was inside a city center or out, I think it's better to explain it through this idea of direct control and abandonment. Now, speaking of the Palestinian Authority is a political problem for an Israeli. And I have to make a mistake in long politics in Israel. That's why it's difficult for me to come and criticize the Palestinian Authority, even though I have a whole breadth of criticisms. And the major criticism stems from the way the Oslo Accord is structured, right? I mean, what the Oslo Accord did was it took the military civil administration that it was kind of classic indirect rule. 500 officers of the civil Israeli officers and 30,000 Palestinian workers, and this goes on from 1981 till 1992. And then the Oslo Accords come and they dismantle the civil military administration, create joint committees. Palestinian workers of the civil administration go home and partially are employed by the Palestinian Authority. A double-headed bureaucracy is created in which you have the Israelis working alongside the Palestinian bureaucracy, which what it did for the population was it doubled the bureaucracy that's ultimate. And at one point, with the Palestinian Authority continually updating the Palestinian registry, because if they wouldn't, but the population registry, then people wouldn't have access to going and coming through the borders because there wasn't sovereignty. So, okay, so the double-headed bureaucracy meant that Israel no longer took care of the civilian affairs, basically, but it had the Palestinian Authority that did most of the work, but didn't make the decisions. And this goes on until 2000. 2,000 people are shooting at each other. The Palestinian and Israeli forces. After one goes on the mount, everything goes haywire, and people are actually describing how people that were patrolling together got off their jeeps and shouted at each other. So, in that sense, it's a little bit of a symmetric account right now, but what I'm saying is that this double-headed bureaucracy collapses, and then what stays is a system where the Israeli system was geared to work with the Palestinian Authority, stopped working with the Palestinian Authority, and then the population had to get whatever its administrative needs directly from the Israelis that were completely not ready for it, which just meant general mayhem and no real services. And another side of it is how Palestinian security forces employ very, very similar practices to Israeli practices when they come to rural population. And, like, for instance, when students in Gaza protest, they say they'd rather have the border police than the Palestinian police, because with the border police, you could appeal and file more complaints with more organization. Okay, so let me see if there's others who want to get in. Lisa, do you want to answer or respond?
Sure. Well, I'm going to have to pull a Sarah Palin. I'm going to answer the question I want to answer because I couldn't completely hear. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, is everything okay? Okay. I'm going to speak a little bit to what happened. I think I heard Daryl mentioning Gaza a bit. And what's happened vis-a-vis Gaza in terms of the military courts or the legal capacity for Israel, or the capacity for Israel to continue to assert a kind of legal control over Gazans. Of course, the official myth that's been propagated by the state of Israel since 2005 is that the occupation of Gaza ended. And one of the manifestations of that was the closing of the military court in Erez. But at the same time, Israel, the Knesset passed a law in 2006, which has essentially been used almost exclusively to continue to arrest, charge in Israeli civilian courts and imprison in Israel Palestinians from Gaza. And Israel also adopted a law, their unlawful combatants law, whatever it's called, modeled on the US law, originally promulgated to justify the imprisonment of Lebanese who'd been kidnapped and were being used as bargaining chips. But since 2005, that law has mainly been used to administratively detain Gazans. And so to some extent, the ability to continue to arrest, prosecute, and imprison Gazans is a manifestation of the continuing effective control, which is the criteria for understanding that the occupation of Gaza continues, despite the fact that there's no longer, a permanent military fixture on the ground, including the military courts. I think just looking at some of those legal processes are among the many ways in which we can see the continuation of the occupation of Gaza.
Yes, I think I'll try to.
Turn the volume down on her thing.
I'll try to tie together some of the responses that Yael and Lisa gave. I think some critics have talked about the Palestinian Authority, for example, as this sort of private contractor for Israel in terms of control and kind of making control more efficient in some respects. And it's interesting to see what kind of issues Israel decides to pull out of and what legacies Israel has on kind of Palestinian control mechanisms. So I won't repeat what my fellows to the panel said, but I think more specifically, just for example, with regard to the military courts, now Israel has the power to decide which kind of cases it wants to try in military courts and what kind of cases it's not really interested in, right? So if, for example, you have a Palestinian committing an offense against another Palestinian, well, who cares, really? Then that can go to the Palestinian Authority courts, and that's what happens. Yeah.
Could it exercise jurisdiction in those cases
Yeah.
if it wanted to? Say if it was
Yeah.
like a collaborator or a person of interest. So there's an actual procedural mechanism to have cases removed from one forum to another, and both sides can.
The military commander retains discretion over the forum, the legal forum, right? So I guess if it would be kind of a specific case that is nevertheless interesting, then the military could. It's kind of similar to the way that military courts have jurisdiction over Israeli settlers, right? But they don't use it. So that's one aspect. Another thing with regard to, you asked about Palestinian strategies and experiences. So I want to kind of go back to my case, my test case of sorts, of Palestinian children. And one of the quotes that I used referred, it was I think Supreme Court Judge Yakim Wilson that described prison as kind of a university for terrorism. Remember that? So actually this image of prison as a university comes from Palestinian discourses. Because in kind of Palestinian society, prison has come to be viewed as this kind of a rite of passage, especially for boys. And the detainees and prisoners themselves actually call and refer to the prison as a university, and there is evidence that Israel is aware of that kind of discourse. So you see that image being kind of co-opted in a way, hijacked, and really transformed in a very disturbing way, a very different way, so that the prisoners are then, or the desire is to govern the prisoners through their own conceptual framework. Right?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was getting at with talking about post-Oslo adaptations that might have escaped larger notice, and doing so in conversation with international legal norms. Just one quick point before you move back. I think the other thing that just bears repeating is that the panelists did an excellent job of demonstrating why one should be wary of placing too much of a conceptual emphasis on the distinction between military and civilian courts. That there's a broad spectrum of practices that are interweaving, and sort of as someone who comes from kind of an American litigation context, one of the things that people I talk to are always a bit surprised about when we talk about human rights in the Israeli courts is that with the U.S., when we think of the litigation in the war on terror, Guantanamo, Bagram, and so on, there are many of the sort of threshold questions that are very vexing, involve questions of jurisdiction and standing, and sort of where certain kinds of judicial review can exist territorially and extraterritorially. But this is generally not a problem in the Israeli courts, from what I understand. That as far as the Israeli Supreme Court is concerned, it's possible to review all manner of military decisions that would not be possible in the U.S. context. And to the extent that is true, I think it actually just reflects this larger process of annexation that's going on the ground, right? That it's not so much that there's like a wall that divides civilian and military jurisdiction per se, but rather that there's a supreme judicial authority that the Supreme Court sits on top of, and the military is just one of the different instruments that are involved in that setup.
Thank you for one of the lectures.
Keep your voice up.
Yeah, sorry. I wanted to ask a little bit, it was mentioned in both like Hedi's talk and was raised again by Daryl about the role of human rights discourses and organization. And it seems to me that you all have been a little lenient about the participation, the active participation of both Jewish Israeli and international human rights and human rights organization and humanitarian agencies in actual governing, rather than just in providing a language that could be co-opted or adjusted in either legal processes or in other mechanisms. So if any of you, I mean, this has been a very big discourse among activists and intellectuals about, from humanitarian agencies, funding the occupation for the last decade or more, to human rights organization, actual work on the ground in preparing cases, in generating categories. If any of you would like to, and that kind of became also a way to kind of contest the simply colonial / state form of the occupation, and argue that there's an internationalization of the sovereign capacity. Certainly both in Gaza and the West Bank in different ways. So if you could refer to that.
I have many thoughts that I didn't mention.
Would you begin with an answer, but just rephrase if you can, condense the question so that Lisa can hear it.
Right. So Lisa, Tal's question basically was, what about the role of NGOs and the international community, both sort of Jewish Israeli NGOs within Israel and also the international community writ large? What about its role in not only providing a language that the Israeli authorities can co-opt, but also participating directly or indirectly in maintaining the occupation and other means of control? Is that inaccurate?
Yeah, in actual governing, whether it's production of knowledge or different economically. I mean, there's various ways in which. Yeah.
Are you asking me to speak to that question historically? I mean, sort of beginning with the development of just a brief summary of the development of both the language and the politics of human rights, or were you?
No. It seems to have been it seems to have been a lacuna in the discussion over military courts.
So I was saying that it was.
I can hear Daryl better.
Yeah, I'm just repeating it for you, Lisa.
Exactly what you want me to focus on about NGOs.
It was just a statement that Tal was making to the panel as a whole, and I was repeating it for your benefit. That's all. I mean, if you have, like, you're not obligated to answer, but if you have an answer, that would be great.
All right, I'm gonna have to pull Sarah Palin again, just because it's a little bit mumbled. But to some extent, I mean, I think that, you know, when we think about the role of NGOs and the use of international human rights law in particular, I mean, my understanding of it is that what we come to now think of as the international human rights movement really got its start in places like the West Bank and Gaza, in places like apartheid South Africa, Latin America during the period of the military regimes. It was periods of intense state-caused, violence and repression where people, and particularly in, South Africa and Israel-Palestine, were looking to a means through which to reframe their experiences and recast, the conflict in a more appealing international way. And so, to some extent, one of the early and most significant human rights organizations on an international level, comes out of the West Bank, and it comes out of lawyers specifically working in the military courts. It was Al-Haq. Shortly thereafter, a branch was established in Gaza. And when the first Intifada started, we see the first human rights organizations really getting off the ground in Israel. And that first Intifada was very much a means, through many ways, of making new uses of the law to forge a counter-hegemonic discourse, to critique Israeli interpretations of their responsibilities or lack thereof, and that kind of transnational activism. I mean, I think that over the decades, as the conflict has changed but not gotten necessarily better, there is, skepticism about the role of law, certainly critiques of human rights organizations as perhaps too beholden to their funders or Western agendas and so on. But I think that, the language, the politics, and the uses of human rights and the role of NGOs has indisputably altered the way in which the conflict is seen and talked about. And certainly it's forced some degree of changes in Israeli policies, not necessarily for the better, but in that sense it shows some degree to which legal language and the use of laws, litigation, and legal activism can have an impact. And I really think that, coming back to the role of the military courts, it was the military court settings that really gave rise to this. And so it has a transnational and international significance in that regard.
Daryl, I know you want to weigh in, and so does Yael.
So, it's safe to say that the conflict, well, but more specifically the management of Palestinians, has always been an internationalized issue. UNRWA, of course, is just a massive example of that, right? So since 1948, obviously, but also in 1967, when UNRWA facilities came under Israeli control in the context of the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, the international community has been paying a huge part of the bill for the upkeep of the occupied population, and in ways that raise very serious questions under international humanitarian law about the responsibilities of the occupier. Also, Jordan continued to pay the salaries of civil servants in the West Bank up until 1988 probably, when Keep Hussein kind of gave it up. So Israel has had many partners. It has had its pick of partners in managing the population. So, which is not to dismiss what you said, it's to acknowledge that this is just an integral part of the scene. I think maybe one reason why it didn't necessarily come up in this presentation is that courts tend to be the stick, whereas the international partners have been more involved in the carrots as far as the governance equation is concerned. So that might be why it has not been as prominent in the presentation, but it's definitely there. I've been around discussions amongst the NGOs and donors for years over whether or not we should keep litigating cases in the Israeli courts. Are we legitimizing the occupation? I mean, these are debates that have been going on for a long time. They don't seem to be getting resolved anytime soon. There are obvious incentive structures in place for why they continue to happen, which other people probably can speak to with more knowledge than me. But anyway, just wanted to throw that out there.
Well,
I hope I'm not sorry to say what I'm going to be saying. Yes, I personally think one of the reasons I left the human rights complex in Israel was because I felt that not only were we legitimizing the occupation in a very, very deep way, we produced the knowledge that was needed. The criteria that I've talked about, it was created in order to answer the Supreme Court petition. It didn't exist in that solidified form. It was not an iron criteria and computerized until that moment, because the thing is that one of the problems with the human rights structure is that what it says is the occupation doesn't run like a regular bureaucracy. It doesn't run based on law and accountability, and there's no good decision structures, and people don't participate in decision making, and all of that. And so, and what it doesn't see, and I think this is colonial, I think it's part of the colonial discourse, where you have a bureaucracy that simply, what the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, when it tries to petition the Supreme Court to make things accountable or to have rules, for this, many times the petitions are, make rules, make criteria. And I used to say, don't make criteria, don't make rules, let us bribe people, let us get people through the loopholes, let us work in that way, because that still allows you for some fluidity. Because as soon as you have rules and a rational legal apparatus, or at least one that looks that way, there's no way to fight that. And so in that sense, having, Amira Haas likes to talk about this. She says that it was much better when everybody sweated at the checkpoints together. So you were hot and you were sweaty and the violence was violence, but everybody had, was experiencing the world or the conditions of the natural world as together as humans in that sense. And now that there's no need for that because checkpoints are these massive structures in which soldiers speak out through these technological apparatuses, there's no relation there. There's no experience there. Drones can be, people can sit in the comfort, in big squiggly chairs and fire on people. So there's that lack of experience. Another side of it is the international community in a big way, and I thought to just tell you, it was kind of a breaking point for me. I went to visit. I went to ofThe prison before it became a prison. It was a military prison, and then it became a civil prison, the Shabazz prison. And before that, I went to visit two detainees from Budus that were a part of the Popular Committee. And I didn't know this was really early on, and I didn't know my way around, so I came around the back of the prison, and they didn't understand what I was doing there, so they let me in. So they let me in through the back and took me to where the lawyers are supposed to meet their clients. But it was, I can't remember exactly why, but there were a lot of detainees at that time. There was some sort of operation going on. I can't remember exactly which one it was. And so prisoners were sleeping out in tents, and I saw these giant piles of like watermelons and bananas and just provisions, And I say to Aviv, what is this? And he said, well, we just got this from the EU. And I said, what do you mean you just got this from the EU? Isn't the prison supposed to give you food? He said, yeah, but the prison food is really bad. This is why they got the Nobel. The prison food is really bad, so the Palestinian Authority gets money from the EU, just like it gets money to pay our lawyers, and also 1,000 shekels for each prisoner's family, which is kind of sustenance when there's nothing else. So when you think of these structures, and this is very hard to say because I don't want this to sound at all like I'm attacking anyone that had their only means for self-sustenance is to rely on funding coming from European donors, going to Palestinian Authority, then being redistributed to lawyers and their families. I'm not criticizing these people. I don't think anybody should. The structure definitely should be dismantled. Question is, how do you do it? We've tried numerous times to organize lawyer strikes that have all failed for all kinds of reasons. For instance, we tried to create this thing where people declare themselves as prisoners of war, and that would be the challenge to jurisdiction. Actually, I mean, if anybody wants to say, okay, so what's the solution to all this? If people declare themselves as prisoners of war and refuse to be tried on a massive basis, the military courts will lose credibility. If people say, I will not participate in this trial because I'm a prisoner of war. Now, the reason that people don't say that is because that means that they will be released only at the end of the conflict, and nobody knows when that is. And that's why people don't do it, and they're probably smart for doing so. But if there's a way out of the jurisdiction issue, it's through refusing to be tried as a prisoner of war.
Insisting to be tried. Insisting to be treated as a prisoner of war and refusing trial.
Refusing trial as a military.
Yeah, well, you basically said what I wanted to say, so this is really helpful. I'll keep it short.
You should say it again.
Okay, yeah.
So I won't single it out for it.
Right. No, I'll try to add and make it more concrete in some senses. I just wanted to comment on the prisoners of war issue, that there were some arguments by prisoners in '67 when the occupation just started, and I think the film actually refers to that, and that was their argument, and basically the military court rejected their attempt to use that category. I don't remember the exact reasoning that was used in that case, but I think the general idea was that they weren't prisoners of war, but rather illegal combatants, what we now call, which is a really interesting kind of interim category, very creative one, and once again shows how law can be used very creatively to achieve certain aims. I think with human rights, the dilemma obviously is usually between kind of trying to help the specific person that you're dealing with, right? It's really difficult to resist what you understand as one person's plight. And then on the other hand, there's the risk of legitimizing and becoming part of the system as a whole. So I said I'll try to make this more concrete with regard specifically to the reform I was talking about. As Israel was designing these legal changes, it actually did contact NGOs, Palestinian NGOs included. So just imagine you're a Palestinian NGO, and you've just been contacted by the military, which wants to make these enormous changes, including some of the things you've been advocating so vocally for years. Apparently, that kind of temptation couldn't be resisted. But yes, these NGOs did advise the military on what they thought were the appropriate steps. Obviously, then there's a process of the military kind of processing that and selecting what it views as the most appropriate steps for its understanding of the situation. But nevertheless, I think the military is truly influenced by NGOs. It's not just a pretense of saying, okay, let's just contact them and then do whatever we want to do, and we can then say, okay, we asked what they think. The military is genuinely affected to some degree by this knowledge that is then fed into the system as a whole.
We're going to come back to that.
He's hiding in the corner.
I'm interested in the civil rights, not political, civil rights of Palestinians as opposed to other Israelis and other Palestinians.
The question is about the civil rights of Israeli-Palestinians as opposed to others living elsewhere.
As opposed to Jewish Israelis and non-Israeli Palestinians.
As opposed to Jewish Israelis and
Palestinians living elsewhere.
Palestinians
It's
who are
just
not
a very broad issue,
Well,
I think.
I think very briefly, like the people, so between 1949 and 1966, there was a military government that ruled the Palestinian citizens of Israel, basically those that managed to stay after 48. And then between 66 and 67, there was no military government, not inside, not outside. In 67, there was a military government in the territories. What happened with the Palestinian citizens of Israel is that they do have formal rights, formal political rights, and in sense, and they also have formal civil rights. They just don't have the institutional infrastructure to exercise them. What do I mean by that? If a Palestinian citizen of Israel wants to go to Hebrew University, they will get funding to go to the university, and they will, they can apply and everything. The thing is that they don't have the educational resources, and they also have to pass a psychometrics exam, which is specifically difficult for the Palestinian population for cultural reasons. It's just I'm just giving an example, but this happens in every aspect of life. The financial aspect, for instance, there's no permits that are given for building. So if you're a Palestinian family and you want to build a house next to your parents in a village, that house will be automatically illegal, and you'll be under a threat of house demolition because there are no zoning. There's no zoning plans for Palestinian cities. So you're automatically operating within the illegal area, and what happens is you build and then you battle for housing demolitions, and you get fined. And so everything is possible formally, and in practice there's this decoupling between the rights that exist formally in the law and the administrative practice. And this is true about everything, because essentially also the security practice. The bureaucracy of the occupation works also on the Palestinian citizens of Israel, also in the sense that if a border police is checking ID, they're going to check every Palestinian's ID. And also there's no, like for instance, Palestinian Israelis can enter the territories without a problem. There's no rule against that, even though the law doesn't allow Israelis to go into the A territory. And it's endless, but just basically it's I think the formal versus the practice, and there's institutional discrimination on every level. So it's not, you don't have the resource, there's discrimination on allocation of resources and infrastructure. There's also discrimination at the specific case. So also collectively and also specifically.
Yeah, I'll just add that I think what makes the case of Israeli-Palestinians really complicated is this gap between the formal law and the law in practice, right? Or what Yael referred to just now as institutionalized discrimination. Because you do have instances when it's very kind of evident that Israeli-Palestinians are being treated differently than Jews. For example, at airports, it's just completely different practices for the two populations. But then you have effective discrimination. So I'll just use a story really, which I think highlights this really interestingly. There was a ruling of an Israeli judge in a civil court last year, I think, or 2 years ago, which concerned the case of an Israeli-Palestinian child. The sentence was relatively harsh, and the judge, I think it was an appeals court, and the judge decided to shorten the sentence because he viewed this sentence as discriminatory. He actually said that he genuinely thinks that it was based on the national identity of the child. Well, obviously the state didn't like that assertion, and I think it was appealed to a higher instance, which then overruled the decision of that court. And what was really difficult for the attorney who represented the child in the highest instance, what was really difficult is proving that there is discrimination. I mean, it is common knowledge. The judge said it, and the Israeli judge said it. But so in a way, in a twisted, very twisted way, it is sometimes helpful when you want to make a case for discrimination that it's actually formalized, right? It can be more effective sometimes when it's not put on paper, right? But it's more difficult to challenge.
One last thing about Palestinian Israelis is the presence of the security service in every aspect of life. It's a very, very important part. Actually, the head of the security service, Yael, I think in 2009 or 2010, wrote it in a reply to an interview to a Palestinian Israeli newspaper that the Secret Service was engaged in activities against anyone that was working against Israel being a Jewish state, which means any Palestinian citizen that was politically engaged. And that means, here we are, here's the Secret Service, and you are our suspect population, like Aviv said.
Wasn't there a time when the Shin Bet was also vetting all the school teachers?
They still do.
Yeah. So school teachers in Palestinian schools inside Israel all have to be vetted by security schools.
So, does Sarah Palin have anything to say to this? Lisa?
I think she doesn't hear us.
Can you repeat the question?
The question had to do, and you need not feel obliged to answer all of these questions.
It was about inside Israel, right?
It was about the particular rights, civil and otherwise, of Palestinian Israelis as compared with Israelis generally or Palestinians outside Israel.
I think that both Hedi and Yael seem to cover that fairly well, and it's not particularly my specialty, so we can move on to the next question.
No, let me make a comment on the question as well. I was just thinking, when you were talking about the question of the Israeli military, the whole question of the military boards, the military consulting both Palestinian NGOs and international NGOs around sort of how to reform the law. And it just strikes me that it's not, I think they do, obviously, they do want to, right? But it more than pragmatic, there's such a performative dimension of this, right? Both in the sense of reproducing Israel as this liberal democratic state for themselves as a kind of self-image as well as for the international community, that there is a liberalism in the, Israeli state is not, it's very complicated, but that commitment to seeing oneself as a liberal state, I think is really wrapped up in these questions of human rights and humanitarianism, and make the wall, right? How can we make it less painful? But those negotiations went on, so I would take that performative dimension seriously as well.
Yes. Comment, question, whatever. I've gotten extremely pessimistic. I've been watching this for decades and decades, and I can't see that changing a law or a rule or a this or a that has any meaning as long as you have a state that's calling itself democratic, that's calling itself liberal, that really couldn't care less about anything. I mean, it's a gangster state. It's a whatever you want to call it. And unless the world, including the United States, would stand up and scream, mostly with their purse. I mean, I can't see anything that can be done that's going to change anything. It gets worse by the day. Please tell me I'm wrong. I would love to know it.
I'm not sure we're in a position to tell you that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think so, but
I would like to keep us focused, if we can, on the question of law and the rule of law within the context of military occupation, and whether law can maintain any integrity under those circumstances. I know your answer is no.
I mean, to me, it seems that the law is just used and manipulated as one excuse after another. Therefore, is the law law? Is there a rule of law? I mean, I would love to.
But you need not have military occupation, or as you would say, a gangster state, to have those hard questions about law. We have that problem about law everywhere. I'm going to be the law professor here for a second.
Yeah. Yes.
And law is always subject to that kind of manipulation, no matter what level of justice or injustice justice one lives under. That's amplified in the context of Israel-Palestine, I think. And maybe what we learn from this and can take away from it is the degree to which it's laid bare. The absence of any kind of actual roots that we can look to that anchor law in something other than mere power is so clear in this context. And I think some of the comments that Daryl had earlier about what we can learn from other contexts the United States has taken up are further illustrations of that corruptness of the rule of law as a tool of justice or as a tool of freedom. Yeah. Sorry. Okay, we're getting close to the end here, so maybe you could
So
answer the question.
I'll try and answer. So I guess my question is sort of temporal and inevitability. So yeah, you described this as sort of as a very colonial thing, and as you were describing the system, I'm thinking of Solzhenitsyn's Golden Archipelago, and he's not a colonial, but it reads very much the same. And I think the common sort of arbitrariness to me seems to be the common sort of ground. Now, my question about inevitability or temporality is this something that's inevitable to any system in which the ruled and the rulers are not sort of connected? Is there a way to have an enlightened occupation? Is it something that collapses after a short amount of time that you can maintain, or again, is this just something you can't run away from?
So for you answer. Other questions? Yes.
I was just curious what difference, if any, the drones and technology make, like wiretapping, let's say, or database technology, which allows greater ability to keep track of things, which is the theory. And also, in particular, there's a movie I saw recently called The Gatekeepers, which is interviews with heads of the Shin Bet, and I was curious on that.
So the question has to do with the degree to which technology becomes a game changer in the law.
Thank you for the interventions because I didn't know it. And I would like to ask, maybe, I don't know if it's related or not, but has the new role of the Palestinian, the new Palestinian state that has been recognized by the UN as an observer state is going to change in some way this military occupation or control, or, I don't know if, I know that it's very complicated, but in some way, which are the perspectives of development about this?
Okay, I'm glad someone finally asked that question. So is the statehood or whatever it is the UN did the other day, is that a game changer?
Yeah,
Right, in the international context or on the ground. Right, last thought?
I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on what the rules of evidence are, if any, in these military trials, what the burden of persuasion is. Here it would be beyond a reasonable doubt. Are Palestinians allowed to bring witnesses? And maybe also if there's been, what the percentage of people who take pleas are, and if that's changed since the second audit over time.
Okay, what are the rules of criminal procedure in the military courtrooms and plea rates? Now, we can't answer all of these questions, so what I might do is ask each of you to say something short-ish that might respond to one of these questions. Is that a fair way to sum things up? So why don't we start with Lisa, since we began with you?
I think many of the last questions seem very interesting. I'm going to speak to the woman who I could hear better than anybody else, the one who asked the first question there. And it's basically about, is there anything to be optimistic about the law in the face of all of the, ways in which law can be used to repress, suppress, discriminate? And, I'm going to give you a very short answer. If the law didn't matter at all, and if there wasn't a possibility of using the law, maybe not fully achievable right now, but it's a prospect, then the United Kingdom would have not made its yes vote on Palestine's statehood contingent on Mahmoud Abbas agreeing not to pursue international criminal court charges against Israel. That's a matter of law, and that's something prospective and suggestive of the power and the possibilities of law.
Yeah, I'll just kind of pick up on that point with regard to the recognition of Palestine as an observer state. So there are two questions here. One is what the implication of that might be in terms of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, Okay, I won't comment on that. I can though, but I won't. It is interesting to note though that even if Palestine is recognized as a full-fledged state, Israeli law still reserves jurisdictions over crimes committed against Israelis anywhere in the world. And I'm not talking about the military law now, I'm talking about the normal criminal law, because Israel has extraterritorial jurisdiction in that regard. So that's just something that is important to bear in mind.
Okay, briefly.
I can see you've got 4 points here.
I just wrote down the questions. Okay. I think that this is what racial hierarchy does. It creates a completely and entirely different model of bureaucracy. And I don't think, and I don't think it's just about arbitrariness at all. I think that it's a very systematic bureaucracy that's not just arbitrarily about using power. It's much more complex. It has all kinds of capabilities, because what it does is it enables decision makers on the ground to be the law, while it takes away responsibility from the politicians at the higher echelons, or even the higher echelons of the bureaucracy itself, while giving legitimacy to the decisions that are being done on the ground. So the fact that you have conflicting decisions and wide discretion actually enables it. I call it effective inefficiency, and it really works when you're trying to control population and confuse. And there's all kinds of other parts of it, but I definitely think that this is not about arbitrariness, and in a way, if it was, it would be a much easier kind of thing. And no, I don't think it can be corrected. I think that all occupation institutions must be dismantled before anybody can talk about anything. Basically, until there's no basic rights, even forget the access, forget the mobility, forget the quality part, just basic formal equality. About Palestinian state, I think what it does is it enables Palestinians to create their own institutions within the Palestinian state on a community level and on both on a national level. And that's a very important limitation, because as long as those institutions are not in place, the default is the Israeli institutions or the Palestinian Authority that works with them. So in a way, I think that there is a very important internal thing.
Two quick thoughts about the question of Palestinian statehood that are not ones that are as commonly raised. The first is that over the long term, Israel's logic with respect to the population that it's ruling is that it's trying to maximize its control while minimizing its responsibility. And the corollary of that is that for the native administration, the so-called Palestinian Authority, it's trying to load it with as much responsibility and as little power as possible. And this has basically been the pattern from 1993 onwards, right? So arrest all the terrorists, but of course you can't arrest them because we're bombing your police stations, et cetera, et cetera. My concern with the statehood bit, in addition to issues about refugee rights and so on, is that it would stretch this relationship between power and responsibility even further in a way that could be quite problematic. By which I mean, A, the main reason why international recognition of statehood is a problem for Israel is not because of the ICC. They have other ways of taking care of that. It's because although the Palestinian Authority plays a useful role in legitimizing the occupation in the West Bank, Israel can actually get more out of them into the long term. Because as long as there's a single Palestinian Authority that claims to represent all Palestinians in this part of Palestine, that's actually still an obstacle. Israel, I think, is waiting out for a possibility where conditions on the ground accelerate geographical fragmentation to the point where we won't even have one Palestinian Authority, or now the de facto two. Even within the West Bank, we can arrive at a situation in 10, 15, or maybe even fewer years where localized pockets of Palestinian community and management are so separated from each other that there can't even be a Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. Now, this is not a new idea. Israel floated the idea of the village leagues as a model for highly autonomous, fragmented governance as far back as the 1970s. So I think recognition of statehood it puts a wrinkle in that plan. And I think that's a more important reason for Israel to be concerned about it. That being said, if the state of Palestine assumes a deeper international legal personality over time, what will probably happen will be that Israel will actually start to exploit the responsibility part more than the power part. So one thing that I'm particularly concerned about is future financial aid to the Palestinian Authority being restructured as loans rather than grants. Basically the idea being that, okay, if you want to be like any other third world state, then we're going to start treating you like one, and you'll have sovereign debt without sovereignty.
Wow. Well, on that hopeful note, I want to please join me in thanking our panelists. And the Center for Palestine Studies for hosting this wonderful event. Thank you.